Mark, Prime Ministers usually give press conferences when they have something big to announce. That wasn't the case this morning?
Well, I suppose it was big in the sense that there was a back down from the government on a part of this military pay deal where the government has agreed now to restore some allowances that were being clipped as a result of the pay deal that's being offered. And this, of course, is a major political problem for the government. It's causing problems in the Senate, it's causing problems from Senator Lambie, but also from the opposition, which is tearing strips off the government for offering a pay deal that's below inflation. So the government has I guess backflipped a bit or conceded some ground here and restored a whole raft, I think 5 or 6 allowances to our uniformed services. That's a fair concession. But having said that, the Prime Minister then made it quite clear that what he was really there for was to be accountable for the government's deteriorating political position in the light of the Victorian election and in light of last week's very messy period. He described it as a ragged week and then opened himself up to questions on whatever, and that doesn't happen that often.
So how concerned do you think, and I think people will be interested to hear this, after the Victorian election and that bad week for the government last week, what's the mood here? What are people in Labor saying? What are people in the government saying? Can you give us a kind of insight in what the political practitioners are thinking?
Well, I think Labor has seen this as a huge morale boost, and you know, such is the binary nature of politics. One side's up means the other side's down. So Labor is extremely cock-a-hoop about the Victorian election result, because it is so rare for governments to just be tossed out after one term, and it has raised the prospect of that being possible at the federal level as well. It's always possible, but it just about never happens, and it's now happened in Victoria. And Labor thinks that it's it's well ahead in the polls. This government federally in Canberra is quite unpopular. Tony Abbott's own popularity is low. Mistakes are coming, and the budget's gridlocked. So there's a sense that unless things improve for the government, it genuinely does face the chance of being tossed out in 2016, and that's what the Victorian result represents. So, in short order, short answer to your question, one side's happy and one side's pretty worried.
Now, one of the big problems for the government, of course, is the budget. There's all sorts of things happening with it that are outside its control, the terms of trade being the major one, iron ore prices, etc. Now, the focus has returned to that thanks to a report and an analysis by Access Deloitte Economics.
Yeah, that's right. That report that's come out today, and Chris Richardson at Deloitte Access has said that their analysis, or his company's analysis of the budget, suggests that it's actually going backwards. It's worse than the situation was at budget time in May. So what was projected to be, I think, about a $29, nearly $30 billion deficit this year is going to blow out by about $5 billion, and that will continue down through the out years of the budget. So the prospect that the government's been holding out of getting back to a state of balance by 2017-18 now looks to be unlikely, virtually impossible, because of declining company tax, declining revenues from iron ore prices and so forth, and because the government has not secured a number of big ticket savings items that it wanted to get through. Its budget is predicated on being able to get these savings through, and a number of them, as we know, just are stalled.
Now, I guess the government was a little careful not to be too vocal in promising a surplus after seeing what had happened to Wayne Swan, but it was there in the budget papers, and I guess the strategy was, by the time the next election was coming, the government will be able to go to the people and say, look, we're going to deliver a surplus, next year, there it is. This sort of suggests that by the time of the next election, they're not going to be able to point to something like that.
It does suggest that. That's precisely what it suggests. By the time we get to the next election, the government was hoping to be able to say, we're about to be in surplus. We've been steadily whittling away this huge deficit left by Labor. We've got it down to a very manageable proportions, and the economy is doing what it ought to do. The budget is going in the right direction, and within a very credible short time frame of a couple of years from 2016, we'll have it in surplus. Now, at the moment, that looks to be too ambitious. All the figures point to a budget that is basically structurally in deficit until the end of this decade, and as Chris Richardson said, the surplus promise at the moment is toast.
So how important do you think it is, as much for the atmospherics as for the policy outcome, for the government to get a win on some of these budget-related measures in this last week's sitting?
Well, it wouldn't want to be too important because I don't think there's too much prospect of it getting a win in this last week. I mean, the big thing that it wants to try and get through this week is the university deregulation changes. Now, there have been furious negotiations going on with the crossbenchers. I think that's to the credit of the government and to the credit of Christopher Pyne, the Education Minister. He's been prepared perhaps more energetically than some other ministers to get in there and do the negotiation. I think he's said that to his colleagues. He's convinced the Treasurer and the Prime Minister that they are going to need to give ground. So on that side, there's some prospect of progress. However, I'm hearing that really the crossbenchers are just not going to agree in sufficient numbers, and this looks like it's also going to be unachievable this year. So we've got the GP co-payment, which of course was abandoned briefly last week before being re-embraced, and that was a bit of a communications and political disaster for the government, to which the Prime Minister has had to refer today as well. But the education stuff looked to be their best hope, and that now looks to be going as well. So how important is this in the longer term? I don't know. I think it was really interesting when the Prime Minister was asked today, does the non-delivery of these things mean that the next budget, and bear in mind Treasurer Joe Hockey is already having to turn his mind to that next budget, does it mean that that next budget will have to have even tougher spending cuts in it in order to make up for the savings they haven't actually achieved yet? And I thought it was interesting that Tony Abbott, when asked about that, said that does not necessarily flow. So I think he's well aware of the fact that the government can only do so much austerity. And the point he made in response to that question was the big savings, the big structural savings that we were hoping to dial into the balance sheet have been outlined in our first budget. We're not going to be keeping on doing horror budgets year after year. I think that would be a great relief to some of his marginal seat colleagues, because they're figuring we can't afford another year like the one we've just had.
Okay, Mark Kenny, thanks for your insights today.
Thanks, Chris.